All right.
Okay.
Okay. So welcome to Night Hacking here at DevNexus 2017 in Atlanta, Georgia. As my guest here is Ray Sang with the Google. So Ray, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for
Thanks
having
for
me
coming
here.
here.
Yeah.
So how's the show going for you so far?
It's fantastic.
All
Yeah,
right.
it's really awesome.
Okay.
Good to be here again. My second time in DevNexus. So.
Great. Okay. And you're presenting here today also? So are you already
yeah.
presented?
I already presented.
Okay.
Actually, had a workshop on the first day. It's a
Okay.
whole day workshop with Red Hat. Actually, together we presented on Kubernetes and containers and OpenShift. And then the second day, I had a 1 hour session. Oh, actually, no, it's a 75-minute session. Basically, tips and tricks for using containers for Java developers.
Well, that sounds like a great title. So can you give us an encapsulation of what you presented? What are some of perhaps first talk about tips and then tricks?
Yeah, sure. So I've been using containers, Docker containers for about 2 years now, and there are some of the troubles I went through previously, and I learned along the way some how to solve those. And these are the things I learned over time, and I really wanted to share with the developers. And to my surprise, a lot of people didn't know about these issues either, or it wasn't on the top of people's mind.
Got it.
So, like for example, one of the first thing that I mentioned was, hey, did you know when you run a container, a Docker container, for example, and when you exit it, the space that was used up by that container is still actually sticking around.
Oh, okay.
So people see the demos, and most of the people use Docker run, and then the image you want to run, and then they just Control C and exit out of it, and keep on doing this for about 20 times, 100 times, and in about 2 weeks or so, you might actually find yourself running out of space.
Good.
And many people actually ran into this issue. And really didn't know why or how to resolve it and prevent it from the future.
So there's some housekeeping that needs to be done along with for Docker management.
Yeah. So you can say garbage collect some of these stale containers later, right? And there are new system commands you can do that in Docker. Release in the new Docker release, but also the best way that I use is actually just when you want to run something, do Docker run. And then --rm. There's a little flag you can add when you're running the container. If you do it that way, then you don't have to clean up afterwards. It will clean it up automatically.
So when you're deploying it, if you use that command, it takes care of it afterwards.
Yeah, exactly,
Okay, cool.
exactly. Yeah. So to my surprise, still a lot of people don't know about this little trick, right? Because if you don't do it, it's going to accumulate over time.
Yeah. And especially, obviously, whether you got Google or Netflix or Etsy, any of these guys, you guys are real heavy users of containers. I heard a couple of million instances or something like that of
So Google launches about more than 2 billion containers per week. But these are not any of the container formats out here today, right now, right? Because we have our own internal systems. This is our own internal formats, and we have our own orchestration tool called Borg to help us, basically orchestrate all of our jobs or applications to be deployed and run on the cluster of machines that we have.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So besides storage, what are the other kind of some of the tips and tricks that would be helpful for people using Docker and containers in general?
Yeah. So another thing that as a developer, when I started to use containers, right? When I started to write the Docker files to kind of put together this runtime environment, and it is nice that rather than converting a machine's disk into the environment running your application, right? We're literally creating a new image that can then be deployed to any machine that doesn't even know or have the environment that you needed to run the app, right? Because the environment's encapsulated into the container. Now, I was just really excited about being able to do this in the first place. So I start to write the Docker files. I start to write all the little command lines into the Docker file to create this environment, and I can run my application. And I thought, okay, I'm done, right? Like this is running, this is great, I'm done. But then sooner or later, I found out and learned it through the other people and online. It's like, wait a second. There are two things I didn't really think about. One is the user that's running the process by default is gonna be root, right?
By default,
It's going to be the root user. And of course, you don't want to run your processes as root. Even though if it's running inside of containers, it has its own view of the file system, but containers are not security boundaries. So you still don't want to run the app as root.
The root.
Yeah. So the first thing that you want to do, right, after you have everything up and running, is to kind of figure out, actually, at the fourth out, you need to think about what user should I be running this process as, and you need to add the user into the container image. You need to switch the user to this this newly created user, and then do all of the things after that. Because otherwise, if you start the process, without switching the user, it's just going to be running as root.
Got it. So we covered storage, we covered users, and making sure you're not running as root as user. Any other tips and tricks?
Yeah, and another thing is the.
I'm sure there's many, but let's pick your top 5 or your top
5,
10.
right? Yeah. The other thing is going back to storage, when again, like after I created this Docker file, right, now everything is running in the right user, but it's still not done yet, right? Potentially you want to optimize the space or the usage of the container image itself, right? Even though the container images are layered, every time you do a command run, a run command in this file, it's going to generate a new layer and another layer on top of that and another layer on top of that. So if your Docker file has, say, 10 command lines, it might potentially generate 10 layers. And basically, the layer sizes won't change. So for example, if you have a layer that downloads, say, Tomcat, right, and another layer that unpacks it, now you have both the size of the Tomcat is in the compressed format, but also in the unpacked format. Now you literally have used up space that you don't otherwise need, because you don't need the archive. You just want the unpacked version of it. So one of the tips and tricks I shared is how do you actually compact the usage of the container image itself in terms of space. So you really want to say run as many logical command lines together and then clean up after it within the same run command. Right. So for example, if you're running using a package manager like apt-get, you do apt-get update, which downloads the metadata, and then you do apt-get install. But after all of that, you want to get rid of the cache data that was previously downloaded. You want to get rid of the archive that was previously downloaded. So you want to add another command to it afterwards, which is just delete the cache data. And you do all of these things in the same command line. And so it will just generate one layer that only uses the space for the actual runtime, but not the temporary archiving storage. Right?
Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Now I know you wanted to actually show something. Was that relating to one of these 3 tips and tricks and tips, or was that something that comes a little later?
So I can either show some of these things, like an example file maybe of the thing I showed yesterday. So I'm not sure if this is showing up. Yeah, I'm gonna wait for this to show up.
I'm glad Steven's here. Helping us manage.
Uh-oh, I just realized, oh, there we go. Oh, I'm online, okay. Okay, so is this online right now? Yeah.
This is, yes.
Okay, cool. So on my screen right now, I got a container that I created yesterday live at the talk. And this is one of the very first container I created about 17 hours ago, right? But you can see that, in this original Docker file, I have multiple command lines here. I got the apt-get, right, which will download the archive for about 8 megabytes, and I do an apt-get install, OpenJDK in this case, which took 495 megabytes. But the JVM is not that big, so why is that happening, right? And then I do a wget because I needed to fetch Tomcat, and Tomcat in compressed format is 9 megabytes, and then I decompress it. That's another 13 megabytes. Right, copy the file, which is the WAR file I have. Right, all of these things kind of adds up.
Yeah, I was just thinking, by themselves, they don't look particularly that big, but I guess it's the fact that they all add up.
Yeah, exactly. But, so I think I created another one called the Hello World Smaller. And in this case, I combined the command lines together. And now, when I install the JDK and wget, it's only going to take up 190 megabytes, which looks more reasonable, right? That's a huge difference, right? From from that to that, like you're going to save a lot of space.
It's more than almost like a 50-60% reduction.
Yeah. And the other thing is I also combined the command line to download Tomcat, decompress it, and then delete the archive. So I save another, say, 9 megabytes here because that temporary archival storage is just not going to be recorded anymore. Okay. So, and the Docker file that I used looks something like that. I don't know if I'm going to zoom in a little bit. So I'm doing it from a base image, and then here's the command line that kind of do everything together. Another thing that I mentioned in my talk is about, if you're using apt-get install, because you're in a non-interactive shell, in this case, right? When you do apt-get install, sometimes they ask you a question like, are you sure you want to continue, right? To answer some of the default questions. Well, rather than being able to do that interactively on the keyboard, in this case, you really just have to say yes to everything, or you have to have another script that kind of understands how to install the app without having to ask you questions. Another thing that I used was to use it with the flag, no install recommends. Depends on the package manager you use. Sometimes they will actually install a bunch of recommended packages, which you may or may not actually want, right? And here's the Tomcat command line where I reduce everything together. So you can use curl to download things, and then you can just pipe the download to the output, std out, and you can untar it on the fly. This way you don't even need to store anything in the temporary layers that is being created. Yep. Yeah. And lastly, you want to run your thing as a different user rather than root. So you got to do that switch.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for kind of going over this. Is there perhaps anything that you wanted to cover in your presentation and weren't able to? Is that just out of kind of curiosity?
Yeah. So actually, after the presentation, there were quite a few questions that came up. And I'm like, oh, wait a second, I have a slide for that. I just didn't get to cover. And there were about, I don't know, maybe 10 people that stuck around and asked a lot of questions. Let me see which one specifically. I'm trying to find the thing that's there. Well, security was one of the big topics that we covered during the talk. But I think there was a lot of questions about, well, how do you test if you have multiple containers? How do you test them together, right? How do you run them together on the user's machine? So, for example, if you have microservice deployment architecture, you have like maybe 3 services you need to run together. They are all containers. How do you test them? And one thing I didn't mention is like tools like Docker Compose, where you can use a YAML file that describes the environment. So say you can say, oh, I want to have a front-end container running that needs to be able to talk to the 2 of the back-end containers, and also run a MySQL. So you can combine all of those things into a single YAML file, and you can just say Docker Compose up, and it will just start all the containers for you with the right linkages among them, and you can test your application that way.
Okay.
But most importantly, the question was really, well, how do you actually configure these containers to be able to talk to other ones in any of the different environments? And the key there is just to make sure your application is configurable via things like environmental variables or command line arguments. So rather than hard coding, say, the MySQL endpoint into say, property files, you can potentially configure that via the environmental variable and say, well, I'm running this instance of the app, right? You passing the address to MySQL directly from the environmental variables.
Great.
Then you can then configure that from many of the different container orchestrators.
Great.
Yeah.
So these are great insider secrets. Just as a kind of last kind of a question.
Sure.
Are you sharing these via a blog? Are you going to write a book?
Yeah.
I'm just kind of curious because the world needs to know this, right?
Yeah. So actually, if you go online, there are many good blogs out there. Actually, Ed Burns was in my session, and he actually live blogged this whole thing. So
Excellent.
he actually helped me document all of the tips I shared.
Great.
So there's a URL to Ed Burns' blog on Twitter, and if you click on that, then you can.
Great. Well, hopefully between that and this live cast here, we can on NightHacking.
Yeah.
We're getting the word out.
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
Well, thank
Very
you so
cool.
much for coming
Hey,
by.
thank you for having me. Cheers.